Hello, everybody, and welcome to the extended free preview of this month's episode of What a Cartoon Movie, all about the Rescuers Down Under. I'm one of your hosts, Bob Mackey, and that's not a podcast. This is a podcast. And who's here with me today?
Cowabunga! It's Henry Gilbert. Hello.
Yes, more than just the turtles say that, and you'll find out in our very long podcast that you're going to hear a little bit of in this extended free preview. We're covering the Rescuers Down Under as the end of our Disney Renaissance Summer, the second we've done in a row. Previously, we've covered things like The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast. Now we're going back to a somewhat forgotten film that still has some very fun qualities to it.
Yes, yeah, and in the chunk of the history segment you're going to hear soon, we talk about how while the actual production wasn't that memorable, it was a huge step forward technologically for the Disney company, and it led to the creation of Caps. And so you're going to learn a lot about the history of Caps, the connection to Pixar and how it got Pixar into the world, into the offices of Disney feature animation, and a ton more. Plus, yes, we also talk about how it only exists because Crocodile Dundee made a bunch of money. And
basically, yeah.
It's very soulless, the choice to make it Down Under. But yeah, we had a whole lot of fun talking about it, and this is closing out. We're so close to the end of just our fourth full year of doing What a Cartoon Movie.
Yeah, if you want to hear the rest of the podcast and get the entire back catalog of What a Cartoon Movie and all like 5+ years of all the other miniseries stuff we've done, head on over to patreon.com/TalkingSimpsons. Sign up at the $10 level. You get access to all of that immediately. I would dare say, I don't know, 1,000 hours of content. Who knows at this point with how many things we've done since the summer of 2017. It's all there waiting for you. Along with our movie podcast, we have miniseries about Futurama, King of the Hill, Mission Hill, The Critic, and Batman the Animated Series. So many things happening, and if you're a fan of us, if you're not a patron, you have not heard that. There are so many podcasts waiting for you at patreon.com/TalkingSimpsons.
All right, so now why don't we throw another shrimp on the Barbie with Jeffrey Katzenberg as we hear the history of how the Rescuers went down under. Okay, so this story begins with the accomplished UK-based writer Marjorie Sharp, who in the post-World War II era was mainly writing adult fiction, but came along with a novel for kids where she came up with the idea of a bunch of mice in a world, basically a secondary society within our own world, and they go on missions to save people. And actually, in the first book, they save an adult man, and I think after that, somebody told Marjorie Sharp, kids are reading this. Your characters need to save children, not adults. Like they need to connect with the kid.
Was this a big series in terms of popularity and in the amount of books written?
You know, perhaps in the 60s and 70s in the UK it was bigger, but it did get 9 total books in the series, so it must have been kind of a success.
I noticed her credit is suggested by.
Yes, yeah.
Well, it feels very passive aggressive.
Well, you know, Sharp, this Down Under is not a adaptation of any one of her books. She never did the Rescuers Go to Australia book, but she actually would pass away 4 months after this movie was released in theaters at 86. So I do think they kind of had to at least like send her a telegram saying like, hey, so we're going to do this. Is that all right?
I bet they were trying to wait her out. She was like on her deathbed. It's like, this has got to make it for Christmas.
But yes, so it begins with a 1959 book called The Rescuers. The pair of the leads are a fancy cultured white mouse named Miss Bianca and a more working class bachelor mouse named Bernard. They are sent to save a Norwegian poet being imprisoned in an unnamed country, which some people say like, it reads like Serbia, but she just didn't want to say it was Serbia. It was then followed by 8 more books over the next couple decades where they would save a bunch of kids. And it was in the second book in 1962 called Miss Bianca where they do save a little kid who... It's Miss Bianca, the second book, is more of what gets adapted into the movie The Rescuers. But this is 62. Walt Disney's still alive, and he actually options the book for adaptation then. So this is a Walt project. It dates back to him. And he had sent out treatments for it in the 60s. But in the first treatment that got done, the prisoner they were going to save was imprisoned in Cuba. And he's like, this is too political. He didn't want to do it then. By the start of 1967, Walt Disney is dead. and the animation studio is entering its dark ages. The 70s would be them exploring a lot of concepts that Walt approved but didn't end up making in his lifetime. So they're like, well, let's try to figure it out without Walt, and also a bunch of shrinking budgets and lowering box office, when meanwhile all of their re-release classics, that's the thing that's making them money.
I think they made 3 animated features in the 70s. Robin Hood, Rescuers, and Aristocats. Is that it?
That's right, yes.
God.
And technically, those 3 Winnie the Pooh shorts that then they jammed into the Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh.
I guess that counts.
That counts. Technically, it's 4, but yeah, and we covered that Winnie the Pooh one a while back on What a Cartoon. But yeah, so they're working on all those. And they're not that successful, in the first 6 years without him. Aristocats, and also there was a feeling internally that like they just keep looking cheaper and cheaper thanks to the Xerox method that began with 101 Dalmatians. Like it just all looks so flat. Like there's great character animation, but you compare it to watching like when we did Pinocchio, compare like the color and texture to everything to what's in Robin Hood, like it's night and day. It looks so cheap.
I mean, the artistry is there, but they don't have the processes to like polish it up like they did in the past. So they can't afford the processes anymore.
And so really just what comes through in those 70s ones is the stuff that they were good at that wasn't determined by budget towards ink and paint, which was character animation that guys like Frank and Ollie and Milt Kahl could get done, and Ken Anderson, guys like them. Those look good. So you can pull up Aristocats and Robin Hood and those Winnie the Pooh shorts. There's some really good character animation in it, but the depth or the art, the artistry of like color and ink and paint, just not there.
Yeah. I guess to explain to listeners, if you don't know what the Xerox method is, essentially they're getting rid of a lot of the cleanup process that was done by hand. In that, my understanding is once things are penciled, they're then inked, but they cut the inking part out. They just were able to Xerox the pencil image and turn up the contrast to make the pencil lines darker. And that's essentially how they were able to remove the inking process from the equation. I believe that's how it worked.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I do think that when you look back on that era being less loved than now in what Disney celebrates, they celebrate the classic era, which is not Xerox, or they celebrate the Disney Renaissance when a new process came in. Those aged much better. The Xerox really didn't age that well. I think
not at all.
I think it worked best for 101 Dalmatians because it pretty much was made to work on like a bunch of spots that all stay in the same place for characters walking around. But so after those 3 movies, they are looking to another concept Walt didn't end up committing to, The Rescuers. And when they turn back to it, they have a lot of ideas. Honestly, the 70s is full of like movies they almost make and then didn't. And that's how The Rescuers ends up in this weird hodgepodge movie. This is not a history on The Rescuers, but just a quick version.
I took a little peek at The Rescuers history, and I saw they just tried every different way to adapt the original story.
Yeah, they originally thought like, okay, what if we set it in the Crusades and they're rescuing King Richard from imprisonment, but that got passed over for Robin Hood, which also allows them to reuse some of those character models they already had. And then when they're working on Rescuers again, they're like, okay, what if they're saving a kid from the bayou? Because they also had a bunch of swamp animals that they designed for a canceled Mark Twain adaptation called Catfish Ben, which is why late into the movie The Rescuers, a bunch of new characters just show up that you're like, wait, where did this rabbit and this turtle and all this come from? I never met these guys before, and they were just a bunch of Catfish Ben losers cast over here. Yeah,
that's so weird. One thing I also thought of, the thing the 70s movies have in common, it's they're very furry heavy. I think it's because of famous Mormon furry Don Bluth.
I think so. I think he was drawn to it, and a lot of others were too. And also, like, they knew how to draw funny animals, They were much more committed to that. But at the core of this film would be Bianca and Bernard, a pair of mice with famous voices. You have Eva Gabor, the Hungarian starlet, most famous for her hilarious work in Green Acres. She is so goddamn funny.
And she was smoking hot in that sitcom, by the way. I learned that as a very little kid. I like this. And then she was also in her 40s in that sitcom. She was not like a young woman in that sitcom.
Her and Eddie Albert, not Edward Albee, Eddie Albert. They are a great couple on that. Yeah.
I mean, I love Bob Newhart, but it feels like weird miscasting where it's like you cast the nebbish husband from a different sitcom, not the one from the sitcom she's actually in.
Yeah.
And he lived until the 2000s, Eddie Albert. I was looking it up.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they didn't want to go too obvious with it. And,
Yeah.
and I mean, who doesn't love comedian Bob Newhart still with us
Yes.
at this very moment? And we
uh,
all love him.
Ava Gabor doesn't get any attention because Zsa Zsa hogged the spotlight. She's slapping cops. She's,
Yeah,
being
she got
a...
all the news
Yeah.
headlines. Yeah, she lived a very crazy life. Though honestly, I'm with her on slapping cops.
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know?
Now I've turned around. I don't know. Traffic cops? I don't know. I don't think they're armed or anything, but who knows?
They kill people too
With their
Man.
little cars.
But yeah, Bob Newhart. I do think casting them both as like this was famous actor stuff, and to help sell the movie, and certainly Bianca and Bernard as characters count on you just knowing Bob Newhart and Ava Gabor and kind of just plastering that onto their characters. But I also think the animators had a lot of fun animating to the voices of Gabor and Newhart. I think, especially Newhart with those stops and starts. I think
Yeah.
people really like that.
His voice acting is so charming, and I wish he did more.
The Simpsons learned the same deal with that. when
Yeah,
they
with
had him
his
on
with
the
his
show.
crusty eulogy that took about 90 seconds.
Oh, so good. But yeah, so they're the leads in it. And not to mention there's a whole lot of other voices in it too, like Pat Buttram is in it, who also from Green Acres. But the most important one is a silly albatross named Orville, who helped them, voiced by Jim Jordan, a.k.a. the Fibber McGee.
I don't know how we know about Fibber McGee, but we do.
Yeah.
I blame an episode of News Radio,
Yep.
but it's one of those things where I'm like, how do I know this?
I think it's only that.
Yeah.
And the short version of The Rescuers is there's a little girl named Penny who has been held captive by a woman named Madame Medusa, who's being forced to search for pirate treasure, which really, I gotta say, I rewatched it for the first time in a long time. This plot is very poorly explained. Like they need 5 more minutes of this movie. They need a better story department, I think. But
So kind of like this movie.
even worse, I'd
Yeah.
say, in a story. And also Madame Medusa is just such a wannabe Cruella DeVille that even in production they said can't we just make this Cruella DeVille? But they were told by one of the Disney higher ups no, it has to be a new character.
Yeah, whenever I see her, I'm like, just why isn't this Cruella? It's just
Yeah.
another evil hag.
Yeah, with less interesting background,
Yeah.
honestly. Yeah, but and yeah, the United Nations of Mice and the Rescue Aid Society there and all that. But mainly the Rescuers 2 was a training space for a lot of new guys in beginner roles like Ron Clements, Glenn Keane, Gary Goldman. But most importantly was Don Bluth, who was the only... There were 4 directing animators on this. This was back in the sequence director era of it instead of co-directors on the whole film. But it's him along with Milt Kahl, Frank, and Ollie. And honestly, I think he had most of the drive creatively on it, more than that.
He's 40 years younger than all those guys.
Yes, yeah. And one, I do think it's not a surprise that after doing this in 77, Bluth and Goldman are pushing to do Secret of Nim in Disney. They're like, we already know how to draw these mice that walk around humans. Let's just do it for this book.
That dude loves mice.
Yeah, he's a weirdo for mice.
The Secret of Nim, Fievel.
I swear, with all these guys just got trained on here's how you do the scale, here's how you draw mice talking to other characters. Well, then let's just stick with that. It really did feel... Little Mermaid felt like such a breath of fresh air that the main characters are human-sized and they have little friends who are cute, but the main characters are people.
I can see why Disney, the corporation, was reluctant to do The Great Mouse Detective. It's more mice.
More of this mice bullshit. It's this. Well, and Rescuers is kind of the death of the mice. This is the last of the mice movies. But so The Rescuers has a somewhat bigger budget compared to other post-Walt films. It's released in 1977 and has a strong initial showing. It's one of the higher performers at the box office that year with good reviews. And alongside a 1983 re-release partnered with Mickey's Christmas Carol, at the box office, it would end up making $160 million worldwide, at least.
I guess it should be noted these movies are so short, they need to be paired with other things to justify the price of a ticket. Like I said, 73 minutes this movie before credits. It's a short one.
And same with The Rescuers, too. It's under 80. And so it's crazy to say this now because after The Little Mermaid, it would not be true. But From 1967 to 1989, The Rescuers was the highest grossing non-Walt movie they made. So
wow.
this explains why they would want to make a sequel to it. It makes no sense now. Like, why would you make a Rescuers sequel? But in 1986, it makes sense. It's easily the best performer of the dark era of Disney. And of course, as we've said many times before, in 1984-85, Michael Eisner and Frank Wells come on. Michael Eisner hires Jeffrey Katzenberg. Jeffrey Katzenberg hires Peter Schneider. They rebuild the entire Disney film infrastructure. And you know what? Jeffrey Katzenberg learned from his time in Paramount, as did Michael Eisner. Sequels. Those make money. And what was the most successful sequel when you came on? Well, The Rescuers. And not only that, it's about detectives, basically. They can just have adventures over and over again. And knowing how old Mike Eisner and Katzenberg are, they probably were thinking, like, they made 1 million of those Nick and Nora Charles Thin Man movies. They can be our Nick and Nora Charles.
Okay, yeah, I get it.
So already you got that in 1986. And hey, what's the second most successful film of 1986?
I'm going to say a little guy called Paul Hogan.
Yes, that's
doing
right.
stuff in Australia.
Paul Hogan's Crocodile Dundee. The Australian comes to New York. Yes.
Oh, yeah, that one's actually in New York, right?
Yeah. And then the sequel is, well, what if you bring a New Yorker to Australia?
I don't think I've seen any of them, but I guess if you weren't alive at the time, and we barely were, they were unimaginably big, especially
big.
for the budget. I was looking it up, and it's like Crocodile Dundee 1 made for $8 million, made like $325 million.
It's insane.
Yeah.
It was such a huge success. And as The Simpsons would put it would start America's short-lived infatuation with Australian culture.
Yeah, I can't watch this movie without thinking of that scene where the Evan Conover is going over the slideshow showing things from Australia.
No, I mean, we lived it. I went through an Australian phase. Like, I had a kangaroo stuffed animal I slept with. Like, I thought platypuses were cool. I loved all these Australian animals. They were like, they totally fit the late 80s, like, extreme, man.
Yeah, I can see, like, me, like, wearing a t-shirt with a kangaroo on and lots of triangles floating around it or something like that.
And koalas are so cute, you know, and they hug you, like,
I say after seeing red pandas, koalas go right in the trash.
Look, if I could hug one, yes, it would be a red panda. Also, because I hear koalas are smelly and also their claws really hurt. But I've seen pictures of people going to, animal preserves in Australia and hugging a koala. I'm like, I want to hug a koala before I die. I want to, as long as it is an ethical preserve and all that, and they're not being hurt and they're actually being taken care of, I would hug that koala.
If our Patreon makes $20,000, we can go to the Koala Hug Ranch.
I guess, there has to be in America a place with some koalas I can pay to hug, right? Yeah, but so yes, in 1986, Crocodile Dundee, a huge success. It did start, or at least exacerbated, a huge Australian craze in America, which I think also we were a little behind Japan on that, because that's why on Nickelodeon they imported like multiple koala anime cartoons.
The Noozles and the Adventures of Little Koala.
Yeah.
I think I like both of them.
I liked them both. We haven't covered either of them, but hey, our pal Paparina on the Knickknacks channel has covered them both very in-depth.
Right.
Yeah, you'll learn a ton. But so yeah, Australian stuff couldn't be bigger. As Mike Gabriel would tell the story in that podcast interview, the concept of The Rescuers Down Under was fully formed and handed to him. He did not pitch it. It was that Jeffrey Katzenberg said, I want a sequel, and also Australian stuff is big right now, so we're doing The Rescuers Down Under. Like, the title was even there from beforehand.
I also think every video game after 86 until maybe like 93, there was a boomerang in it.
Oh, yeah.
Like every character could throw a boomerang.
Oh, my God, yes.
And I think Link still can.
Oh, I mean, it's a cool weapon.
Yeah.
It's
Have you ever thrown, like, I got a Nerf boomerang as a kid. They're not coming back.
No, they don't. I mean, hey, maybe we just suck at throwing boomerangs, But, I mean, there's multiple DC and Marvel supervillains who are boomerang centric too. Did they even throw a boomerang in this movie? I don't think there's a boomerang joke.
I don't think there is a boomerang.
Yeah, what the hell? But yeah, this also is the way Jeffrey Katzenberg also comes to Quibi, which is too late on a fad, and it's unsuccessful. Like, he's like, oh, well, Australian stuff's really popular now in late 1986. I'm sure in 4 years when we release this movie, it'll be just as popular.
The show is over for Jocko, that big Australian guy. No one cares anymore.
I mean, it was a recipe for failure. It's like, and also, as Gabriel said when it was pitched to him too, he's like, why would you make a sequel to that? Like, the Rescuers aren't that interesting. And he was just told, like, we're going to make this with or without you as director because it's the successful movie that we're going to make a sequel to. And Australian stuff is big right now. But we'll get to why he agreed to do it in a second. But yeah, it was just going to be Bianca and Bernard heading down under to save another kid and also his endangered pet eagle. So you also get a little bit of conservation stuff in there too.
Yeah, we're in the environmentalism era. We've forgotten about that now, but
and funnily enough, this movie getting made saved Disney Afternoon from having a crappy Rescuers TV show. Because this is a story for another podcast, but Tad Stones, he was assigned to do a Rescuers cartoon series that would follow DuckTales. And then he was told, no, we just greenlit Down Under. We're not going to have a TV show and the movie at the same time. Think of something else with rescuing people.
Oh, okay.
And thus, the Rescue Rangers were born. And
that's why it's Rescue Rangers.
Yes.
Wow.
I think it was something called, I'm sure Bob will do great research on it when we finally do a Rescue Rangers episode. The only afternoon one we haven't done yet.
I know my wife Nina will be on it. She's a Rescue Rangers fan.
But the version I read was that Tad Stones had this idea for like Mouse Patrol, I think it was called. And then they're like, well, let's put Chip and Dale in that, and it grew from there. And Stones, I think, later in life would say, ultimately, he's happy he did not get Bianca and Bernard because they are coded as so middle-aged that they'd be boring to the kids, and that the Chip and Dale were much more exciting.
I guess they already did a show starring an old guy with DuckTales.
Exactly, yeah. And was Bob Newhart going to record 65 episodes of the Rescuers cartoon in Ava Gabor? I don't think so. I don't think so.
Ava Gabor is already getting too old.
Yeah, and not everybody's a workhorse like Alan Young, you know. But so let's talk about these pair directors on this movie, Mike Gabriel and Hendel Butoy.
That's a funny name.
Yes,
come on, guys, give it up for Hendel.
He's a Romanian-Hungarian stock, so that's where the name comes from. But they were top-level animators of that generation at Disney. Though they don't get as much press as, say, the Muskers and Clements or even the Truesdale and Wise out there. Oh, also their reasoning for hiring these two co-directors was also because after doing sequence directors who were at odds with each other on like the Black Cauldron, they're like, no more of this. But so Mike Gabriel, believe it or not, he didn't go to CalArts. He's one of these only guys who got to his level who wasn't of the CalArts class.
Where did he emerge from? Do we know?
It's actually an amazing story. He is a self-taught animator who I believe didn't even go to college for it.
Wow.
He grew up just with this huge passion for animation, who wanted to like master drawing cartoon characters. He applied to Disney. And the Disney folks were like, well, you're good at drawing cartoons, but you really need to learn like anatomy and all of these basics. And he's like, okay, I'm going to learn them all. And what Disney meant was go to a college and learn this, but he just bought anatomy books and all these things and just like copied them and drew them and learned the craft that way.
It was much harder to do. There weren't YouTube tutorials back then.
I know. He had to go to the library for that stuff. But he through sheer passion of animation, like he learned all this stuff in his craft. He applied, and they were like, wow, you just came out of nowhere, and you're pretty good. After several rejections, he got hired in late 1979, and he jokes that, like, some people think I got hired because a bunch of Bluth people quit, and they just needed bodies. But I got hired right before Bluth quit, so I was hired on my own merits. It wasn't just to fill space. And he was training directly under Nine Old Man, Fox and the Hound, and also Black Cauldron. But in between those, he was also part of, and apologies to this man because I did mispronounce his name on Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Daryl Van Citters, not Kitters.
Sitters, okay.
Sitters. It's spelled Citters. But if you listen to our Roger Rabbit one, he was the original animation director for Roger Rabbit, and he was the guy in charge of all the pre-production work on it before Spielberg got involved. Gabriel worked on all of those projects in the Sitters group, for a time, like including the Mr. Future short and that Soccer Mania thing. And actually, he was so involved early on that if you find some one early promotional image for Who Framed Roger Rabbit that was like internal but sold to people, and you see it like, oh, early Roger Rabbit tests. Mike Gabriel is the guy dressed as Eddie Valiant
that's
standing
him. Okay.
next to the drawing. So yeah, that's how early he was involved in Roger. And he worked on Soccer Mania. He also, Gabriel, worked on Sitter's Group on a canceled planned 20-minute special called Swabbies, where Mickey, Donald, and Goofy were going to join the Navy under the cruel tutelage of Peg Leg Pete. And the designs looked really good, but sadly it got canceled by old Katzenberg. And that was right when Sitters was like, well, fuck this, and he leaves the company.
Oh, wow.
So with Sitters out of the company, Gabriel then moves fully into the Black Cauldron group, which he reflects on as like, yeah, that didn't go great. Like, he's like, yeah, it could have gone better.
I'm trying to forget, and I just did research on it.
And then he moved over to Mouse Detective and Oliver. And this was another interesting thing about Gabriel. Like, he really is a jack of all trades. Like, he got started as an animator and is a really good animator. But then he's like, also gets into the storyboard group for Oliver. He gets in the design team and even some sequence direction. Like, by the end on Oliver and Company, he's basically an assistant director on that film. And also on Mouse Detective, he did mainly the animation on Toby the dog and the large cat that they battle. He had a lot of fun with those characters. Apparently, he tells a story that in an early test screening, Toby the dog was doing great at Mouse Detective with the kids, so he was told, like, animate another couple scenes with Toby. Like, we needed the kids.
Must be why he's on the poster.
Yes, yeah, I bet. Yeah, that definitely feels like Katzenberg going, like, the kids love this Toby.
I didn't remember the dog until you reminded me.
He's the Speedo man of the Toby the movies, but so yeah, he's getting Gabriel's growing as a potential director. So that's when Peter Schneider, Katzenberg's, direct lieutenant in the animation studio, Peter Schneider tells him, we're going to make this Rescuers Down Under. Do you want to do it? And Gabriel had a sneaking suspicion that audiences wouldn't give a crap about the Rescuers, but he was, one, interested in getting the opportunity to be a director, and two, the setting of Australia really did interest him for animating that. And he went through what he said was a very nerve-wracking interview process with Jeffrey Katzenberg, but eventually got approved for it. Then, meanwhile, we got Hendel Butoy. He is a very Christian animator who was born in Brazil in 1958 to Romanian and Hungarian parents.
What were they doing in Brazil?
Lots of Hungarians moved to Brazil in the 40s. Who knows why?
Hey, Eva Gabor's Hungarian.
Yes, yeah, but, well, hey, I just have to say, a white person born in Brazil after World War II, you have questions sometime. That's all. But
maybe they fled for valid reasons.
Well, he would. Okay, so I found the only interview I could find with Hendel Butoy was with a hardcore Christian kook, and so all of his questions were like, "And what about Jesus?" Like, he barely talked about anything, but he definitely said that his father was a Romanian Christian, a Seventh-day Adventist, I believe, who obviously did not want to be part of the war, and so he could either come to America, he could defect to America or defect to Brazil, but if he defected to America, he would have to be a soldier in America, and he didn't want to be a soldier.
I do the same thing. Brazil sounds more fun.
Yeah. Now, his mom, she was going to high school in Brazil, and she's from Hungary, and, Hungary was on not America's side in World War II. But, look, I don't want to cast aspersions at his parents. I'm just saying.
I thought Argentina is where all the Nazis ended up.
Well, now, come on, boys from Brazil. That's the name of the movie.
Right.
Yeah, and if a movie isn't correct about where Brazil... but anyway, okay, so... Though Hendel Butoy, whatever his background, he seems like a totally nice, very Christian man who fell in love with, on top of Christ's love, he fell in love with animation as a kid growing up. He moved to the U.S. at a young age, and he did go to CalArts in that first class with all the other famous names, Musker Clemens, Brad Bird, John Lasseter.
Yawn. Yeah, I've heard this story before. Did they go to CalArts in the early 80s and late 70s?
Yeah. And then go straight onto the lot at Disney Animation? That's right. Yeah, but so Hendel Butoy, though, was one of the better animators of that group. He was quick to the top at Fox and the Hound. He was supervising animator on Gurgi. He is Mr. Gurgi.
Maybe he's so twisted he enjoyed Gurgi.
Gabriel and Butoy, actually, that's where they became friends, because Gabriel animated some scenes of either Gurgi or characters interacting with Gurgi a lot. So that's where they became buddies. And he's like, yeah, I could totally work with this guy in the future. But yeah, Butoy did a lot of work on that, on Great Mouse Detective and Oliver and Company. Also on the path to a potential director's seat of his own. And he also was super in love with the concept of animating Australia more so than the Rescuers returning. So I'm just going to cut to the chase with Butoy. After this movie, if you based on his IMDb, I think he worked on other stuff within Disney, but as a very Christian man in what he calls the secular world.
Oh, no.
I don't think he jibed much with where the company was going in the 90s. And I think Roy Disney protected him to a degree by putting him in charge of a couple shorts that would end up in Fantasia 2000.
Okay.
But once that was over, like, Hindle didn't go on to work on any of the future Disney Renaissance films, really, other than Fantasia 2000, if you count that. And then after that, he was like, you know what? I want to move to Tennessee to teach animation at a very Christian college.
Wow. So I guess if you see any Christian cartoons, he might have some hand in the training of the people working on them or something.
Yeah, he did tell a funny story about how his students are like, wait, I'm in Tennessee as a hardcore Christian wanting to move to this den of sin of Los Angeles to work in animation. You did the reverse. Why did you do it? And he basically just said, like, Christ led him there. He's like, I will say that this 2020 interview he did with this British Christian guy who gave him a bunch of very ugly leading questions, like, it made me think, oh, well, Hindle seems like an okay dude compared to this asshole, but because the guy was like, so Disney's known for corrupting children. How much did you notice of that in the work there? And Hindle was like, well, if I saw something I didn't like, I would say, guys, now. But when he's like, the British guy tells him, I've seen they sneak in some really dirty stuff in there to corrupt the children. And Butoy doesn't really buy into it. He's like, well, yeah, there's some guys who put in jokes for their own amusement, but they usually cut those out, and he wasn't going along with it at the very least.
Hey, he sounds like a good guy. He's trying to turn Memphis into the next Burbank, so
yes, yeah.
Give him some credit.
But yeah, I mean, but him even doing that interview did also make me go like, yeah, come on, dude. You should have. This guy is gross. Like the dude interviewing you is gross, even if you're a good Christian. But clearly, though, with him talking about trying to operate in the secular world of Burbank animation, I don't think he was going to be long for the place. And now he can just teach animation to Jesus freaks, which he's been doing for the last 20 years.
Yeah, so. Hey, he found his calling.
So yes, that's the story of the two guys who got hired to direct this. Mike Gabriel is a real Butoy, I do think, seems like, as far as skill goes, a good craftsman of animation. But Gabriel, I think, is the better director. And based on all the stuff he'd do later, like, he has much more of a creative drive. And he really is responsible for so many great things at Disney over like a 30-year history that he just recently retired from, too.
Yeah, it's a name I didn't recognize.
No,
and I was
neither.
sad when I looked at all of his credits.
It's amazing, his credits, which as long as we're talking about the story of this film, you can't talk about the creation of Rescuers Down Under without talking about Computer Animation Production System.
Yes.
AKA CAPS.
And what surprised me about this movie, not just CAPS and how good this looks compared to Little Mermaid in terms of just how lush it looks and vibrant, but there's a lot of computer animation I wasn't expecting. In fact, it feels like they pulled back after this movie.
Yeah. I think
having never seen it, I'm like, wow, there's all these CGI shots, and then in every movie going forward, like one little dash of CGI here, one little like sprinkle here, but this one they're like, let's do everything we can.
When I saw that opera house, I was like, wow, yeah, I forgot how huge this giant opera house was in the middle of the movie here. Yeah, they so the CAP system, we've touched on it some, but let's get really in depth into this. Basically, we talked about that Xerox system. They've been using it for years. They kind of actually stepped away from it a little bit after Fox and the Hound. Like, Black Cauldron it does use techniques of it, but it certainly doesn't look as flat.
Yeah.
as rescuers.
I didn't
original.
notice it. Yeah, and like sketchy too, which
Yeah,
can be a style, but ultimately it's a style because didn't want to pay for more processes to follow that one.
And Little Mermaid certainly doesn't look like
No.
a Xeroxed film. Yeah, I think they were getting more into that other work, but they were looking for something for the future of the company. It was a big vision. Several executives were in charge of it, but it was a huge project for Roy Disney, and it likely Caps wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for Roy E. Disney, really, because in the short version of Eisner coming in, Roy Disney was a huge part of that happening. Like, he brought him in, and so unlike under the new executive who was going to do that hostile takeover, Roy was able to keep his pet projects going, which included a modernization with computers of their system. So already in the 1980s, there are some very pioneering programmers who are integrating art with computers, including some folks working at Pixar, the division of graphical effects in Lucasfilm. And, they had the most powerful PCs at the time could scan a drawing at what we would call kind of high resolution, like 2K resolution at best, and then color them digitally. And the colors were getting richer. Every new program, they could improve the colors on it. There were several people working on it, but definitely Pixar was at the cutting edge. And when Pixar got bought by Steve Jobs, they were working on a lot of commercials then, and they were pitching themselves to the biggest animation company in the world of like, hey, with this process that at the cutting edge, it will ultimately make animation much cheaper to make for you guys, or at least a degree cheaper to make than it currently is with all your physical models. And so, yeah, I mean, if you look at the flat-looking Xerox process, that was in Mike Gabriel's podcast interview. Even he was like, oh, yeah, Robin Hood just is so flat. We wanted all the mats and stuff and the multiplanes we couldn't do anymore. We really wanted that.
If you look at the very first shot of this movie, you're just zooming through this field of flowers that are all CGI.
Yes,
it's like, well, they could absolutely never do this. And then I noticed even throughout the movie, Mick Leach, his car, his like excavator or whatever the hell that is, his like child capturer,
Yes.
that's a CGI thing he's riding around in.
Yeah. And there's so many multi-plane shots that they really take advantage of, because short version of how Caps would work is that you get a line drawing, you then scan that, and you color those with multiple levels. You don't have to worry about physical ink and paint on a physical cell. And that is very important for layering, because cell density, you can only put so many layers on top of each other to then photograph. Like I think Gabriel said that before Caps that they were mostly limited to like 4 layers of cells. If you had any more than that, then it would cause tech issues.
Cell flare.
Cell flare, yeah.
Which is cool, and it's a fun artifact of the process, but I can see why that would annoy you if you're making the movie. You don't want to see the shadow of the cell on top of the background.
Though I love seeing it in The Simpsons.
Yeah.
When I see a cell flare on a close-up bold shot in The Simpsons.
And an old anime, too.
Yes. Oh, God. So instead, this would be scanning those line drawings. You color them there. That's for character animation. Meanwhile, your background elements, you would also still paint an amazing background, but then you would scan it fully and then use it as a backdrop. And that would allow, instead of how, say, in Bambi or Pinocchio, they do multi-plane shots with very carefully moved multi-panes of glass on top of each other. Now they could do that with dozens or even hundreds of those levels at once in a computer.
Yeah.
Like, it simplified it immensely.
It's like layers in Photoshop to be reductive.
And so, yes, no longer would they be limited by all of that stuff. It would just be what you could digitally scan and layer in there and then output. And also your color palette could expand. The ink and paint team could grow, and there could be much more depth and mattes and finishes and more texture. All of these things. They were getting promised the moon, as Silicon Valley people are wont to do.
And you can make the actual lines different colors,
Yes,
not just black.
Yeah. So much more could be done with it. And a nice thing I learned from this research too, which sounds impossible to imagine now, when they got those computers and were getting their ink and paint teams together, they apparently kept all of their old ink and paint staff, who were a bunch of older women some who had been there since the 40s. They taught them how to color on a computer rather than replacing them with a bunch of young tech bros.
Wow.
Could you ever imagine that happening now?
No, absolutely
No.
not. This is this Eisner's decision or what?
All I know is Gabriel was in his podcast interview. Gabriel was like really proud of the fact that they worked hard to keep all of the old staff and train them in computers rather than replace them.
Yeah, I mean, I knew women were doing that role because of, sexism, mostly. They weren't allowed to
the
achieve.
gals in ink and paint. You can trace over my wonderful male artwork, but
I assume it's like, oh man, all those jobs we can cut. But no, they retain them.
yeah, at least
Most
on
of them.
Rescuers Down Under.
Yeah.
I can't say that it stayed that way
Well,
forever.
those old
but-
ladies had to retire at some point.
Yes. And so thanks to the scanning of the digital layers, which I believe at least in the first run of Rescuers Down Under, it was at 2K, not 4K. It also meant you didn't have to spend on materials like for cell, paint, ink, all that stuff. And that would make retakes or test reels much cheaper to do. Like you could iterate a lot better and faster. And if you're going to layer in all of this stuff, now you can layer in CGI elements into it and not just have to trace over them like they did in Little Mermaid or Great Mouse Detective.
It does astound me that there were computers this powerful in 1990, in 1989, in
Yes,
the late 80s,
yeah.
because like the default resolution in 1990 was like 320 by 200 for home computers.
Yeah. Oh, man. When I was hearing them tell the story about how they were like working with the physical, Mike Gabriel saying like, well, yeah, I just heard, a bunch of multiplanes, all that stuff. I didn't know about servers or space or that like back then there were very few places you could buy gigs of server space from. Those like now that's nothing to us. I throw gigs up into the cloud every single day.
That's true. I wasn't even thinking of that. Like 24 frames per second, and they're each like a 2K image.
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
a lot of space for a late 80s computer to hold.
I know. I mean, that's why it was such an expensive proposition. So going back to when Caps was pitched in '85. Basically, when Katzenberg came on, they kind of had to repitch the process again to skeptical execs because I think it got a soft yes from Ron Miller, and then they get rid of Ron Miller, and so they're like, okay, Eisner, Katzenberg, can we do this? Back then, in '85, they estimated it would cost $12 million. To put that in perspective, the estimated budget for Great Mouse Detective was 14. So basically, just to create Caps would cost as much as the Great Mouse Detective. Though ultimately, they joke. I saw this in Disney War 2. They joked that they said internally, this is absolutely not costing $12 million. This is going to cost way more. If I okay this, it's going to cost way more. Ultimately, they estimated it was more like $30 million.
Wow. But I'm sure it saved them a lot of money.
And I think future-proofed a lot of their movies, too. Like those Beauty and the Beast ages so much better than The Rescuers, really, you know?
And it's very funny to think this movie of very little notoriety is actually the first all-digital movie.
It's the very all-digital movie ever. Yeah, to put it that way, that's crazy. Yeah. So the entire negotiation process took 18 months.
God.
And honestly, selling Caps might have saved Pixar. It was the first actual real big income deal under Steve Jobs' administration of it. Like, because Jobs gets, shoved out of Apple. He takes over Pixar, and selling Caps helps keep the company afloat. They might have not lived long enough to sell more if they hadn't sold Caps. And certainly, I don't think there'd be a Toy Story if they didn't sell Caps in the first place to Disney and start that relationship.
Yeah, you can see Pixar's name in the credits, too.
Yep, yeah. And this was a big one for Roy Disney. He signed the deal with Pixar's then president, Alvy Ray Smith, who that guy was gone from Pixar by the time Toy Story happened or was released. But yeah, it was Roy Disney basically in the Waking Sleeping Beauty doc. There's a funny story of Roy Disney like kind of grumpily pushing Frank Wells to be like, well, I'm not going to leave this room till you sign this check kind of feeling. But he did it. And so the process begins in '85. And as we talked about, in The Little Mermaid, there's a test scene of it, but actually, for historical purposes, the first thing Disney animated with Caps that was released officially, if you watched the 1989 onward openings to the Magical World of Disney specials on TV, there would be a shot of Mickey dressed as in his magician outfit.
I can see it now.
He's on top of the spaceship Earth golf ball, and he does his magic fingers thing. That was all Caps. So that was the first Caps animation, actually. And also, this was a funny thing I learned that I didn't catch in the first Little Mermaid. That last shot of it, that's the cap shot with the rainbow. The animator who did it admits to it now. He's like, I animated the rainbow upside down. The red's on the bottom and purple violets on the top. It's the opposite.
Only rainbow experts know that.
Yes, yeah, we failed as rainbow viewers there, but clearly they're working on it. But it also is like this huge investment, and this never came up in any of my research, even to this day. But I have to think they had hoped that Caps would be ready for Roger Rabbit, because Roger Rabbit is compositing the movie. Like, it is so much compositing, and it cost them so much more money that they didn't have Caps. I bet they were kicking themselves that, like, Caps was not done till 2 years later.
Yeah, the entire Roger Rabbit being an analog process, I feel like they would have saved so much money with Caps.
Oh, God, yeah, they have to all the different cell layers, and they could only do it at ILM, which, it being outside the Disney system probably cost them a lot more money too. Like, yeah, and certainly though they did hope that Caps would make the Roger Rabbit sequel they were definitely going to make. It would be so much easier with Caps, and they did. Not the first one, but the second and third Roger shorts are on Caps. But
okay, yeah, but not, is it Tummy Trouble?
Not Tummy Trouble, no. But yeah, so after that successful test on Little Mermaid, they're fully committed to doing it on Rescuers Down Under. And honestly, the multiple scenes in the film were just outright planned as showcases for Caps' ability. Just to say, like, well, we couldn't do this before. Now we're doing Caps, starting from the first shot of the movie. It's like, honestly feels like a test for The Lion King, the way that shot starts. Yeah, but I think it's to the detriment of the plot that they're just like, well, let's just, show a bunch of digital effects here. Like, we don't need to hear the story of these characters.
Yeah, the first 15 minutes is like, isn't Australia nice? Look how well we can animate it. Look at these cool animals. What story? What story?
Bianca, Bernard, who are these characters? Yeah, but though also, it meant a ton of trial and error. Like, this was creating processes as they did it. Gabriel said he loved the possibility of it, but also hated having to learn on the job about it.
Oh,
They mentioned one thing. Their scariest moment was they constantly were reworking the pipelines and calibrations and all this stuff and learning as they went. In June, ahead of its November release, one of the producers was convinced by the tech team of, we need to change over the computers, but it'll be easy. And hey, if we have trouble while we're doing it, we can just go back. And she's like, okay, you promise me we can go back? He's like, yep, totally can go back. And then 3 days in the process, like, ooh, we're having some trouble. And also, though, we can't go back. And she's like, so my movie might just be lost? And he's like, well, we hope not. And she breaks down crying. She said it was the only time. It's Kathy Davis, the assistant producer on the film. She said it was the only time she ever cried working on a movie.
I guess there was no cloud either.
No.
It was all like, you have to hit Control S.
You have to and physically move things everywhere. But apparently the tech team did figure it out and got it out of its weird pipeline. And it was 6 weeks to completion when this server issue happened.
Wow.
But they constantly had to buy new server space all around. It was a real challenge. But I think really, Beauty and the Beast got to have, I think, a much smoother technical creation thanks to Rescuers being a learning process the year before, which it's also funny. Mike Gabriel has a cute aside that Caps does win a technical Emmy, like the creators of Caps win a technical Oscar the next year in 91. But Gabriel kind of grouses of like, yeah, for Beauty and the Beast, not the movie they actually did first. Like,
well, I guess everyone ignores this movie.
Yep, yeah, totally ignore. But and also internally they were trying. Some people were saying like, can we just do some scenes traditional? Like, it'll make this easier. But the producers held firm. Like, no, this has to all be Caps. We got to learn how to do the whole thing on Caps.